The day my son locked me out of my own house, I still had lasagna cooling on the stove. He changed the locks, emptied my bank account, told the neighbors I was senile, and smiled while doing it. I gave him everything. He took it all and then said I was crazy for noticing. But what he didn't know was I had a plan. And by the time I was done, I'd take back every dollar, every lie, and make him wish he'd never touched my pension. The first time I saw him in court, he smirked. The last time they took him out in cuffs. Before we start, please make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this, and also comment where you're watching from. Thanks. It started on a Thursday. I remember that because Thursdays were the days I used to treat myself to one of those overpriced cinnamon buns from the bakery downtown, and I'd sit by the window pretending I wasn't alone. That morning had been the same as always, quiet, predictable, with my coffee tasting slightly burnt because I still haven't figured out how to replace the gasket in my old percolator. Around 10:30, I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard a knock at the door. I didn't even look through the peephole. I recognized the rhythm. Ethan always knocked like he was announcing himself to royalty. I opened the door with this little jolt of excitement. My son showing up unannounced? That hadn't happened in, 2 years? I wasn't even mad about the short notice. I smiled, stepped back, and before I could say a full, "Well, look who decided to drop by," he wrapped his arms around me in this tight hug that felt like a memory from a long time ago. He smelled like too much cologne and maybe something bitter underneath. I invited him in, told him to sit down, and started the usual small talk. "How's work? How's the apartment? How's the weather in your part of town?" He said he needed coffee, and I figured, sure, that's a fair exchange for a surprise visit from my only child. I walked into the kitchen, half distracted by the idea that maybe, just maybe, this was him finally coming around, maybe apologizing for the last time we'd talked when he told me I didn't understand how money works anymore. I remember grabbing my favorite mug, the blue one with the chipped handle, and thinking I'd heat up some leftovers for lunch. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the deadbolt clicking. I thought maybe I was hearing things. I called out Ethan and walked back toward the front door, still holding the mug. And there he was, standing on the other side of the door, looking through the peephole at me like I was a stranger. I reached for the knob, turned it. It didn't budge. I laughed, actually laughed for a second, like this was some kind of joke. "Very funny," I said. He didn't answer. He just said through the door, voice low and steady, "I'm claiming what's mine." I froze. That's not the kind of thing you hear from your kid. Not when you're the one who clipped coupons and skipped vacations and ate leftovers for 40 years to send him to school. I knocked, not hard, just confused. "Open the door, Ethan." Nothing. "Ethan, open the damn door." Still nothing. I knocked louder, starting to panic a little. My phone was on the table. My keys were in the bowl by the front door. My wallet was inside my purse, which was on the couch. I had nothing but my slippers and a coffee mug. Eventually, he said, again calm, like this was just a business deal, "It's better this way, Mom. You'll understand soon." Then he walked away. I heard the door to the garage open, heard the car engine start. I ran to the window and saw him backing out in my Toyota. That's when it hit me. Not just what was happening, but that he'd planned this. He knew I'd let him in. He knew I'd trust him. I sat down on the porch step, still holding that stupid mug, and it felt like someone had punched a hole straight through my chest. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually, my neighbor Carol came outside to water her plants and saw me. "Louise, are you locked out?" she asked, like maybe I'd forgotten my keys while getting the mail. I didn't answer at first. "What do you even say?" "No, Carol. My son just stole my house." She came over, helped me up, brought me inside. I used her landline to call the police. They said it was a domestic issue. They said if he lived there, which technically he didn't, they couldn't remove him without a formal eviction. I hung up without saying goodbye. Carol gave me tea. I didn't drink. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. That night, when I finally managed to get back inside, with Carol's help and her cousin the locksmith, I noticed the lockbox I kept tucked under the floorboard in the hallway closet was gone. It had held all my pension documents, some cash, A few pieces of jewelry that weren't worth much but meant the world to me, gone. He didn't just lock me out. He took everything. And the worst part wasn't the stuff. It was knowing that the only person I'd trusted my whole life had looked me in the eye and decided I was nothing but a stepping stone, a liability, someone to be cleared out. That's the day I stopped being a mother first. That's the day I became something else entirely. The morning after Ethan locked me out, I barely slept. I kept checking the window every 10 minutes, like some raccoon might come back and steal my garbage, or in this case, my life. I sat in Carol's guest room staring at the ceiling, wondering how many of my neighbors were going to believe the version of the story he'd already started telling. And believe me, he started telling it fast. That day, I called the police again. I wanted to file a formal report. The officer on the phone sounded maybe 22, like he was reading from a script. He asked if Ethan had physically harmed me. No. Did I feel in immediate danger? No, not at that moment. Was he legally a resident of my home? I said no, but the hesitation in my voice gave me away. He'd lived there off and on over the years. The officer sighed, told me I'd need to file a civil claim, not a criminal one, and that these situations can be tricky. Tricky, that's the word he used. Like I'd locked myself out on accident and forgot my son was an adult con man. I hung up and stared at my purse for a good 5 minutes before calling my bank. The woman on the other end, name tag, voice and all, told me she couldn't discuss my account because it had been recently modified to reflect guardian access. I said, "Guardian? I don't have a guardian." She put me on hold. When she came back, her voice was different, nervous. She told me the account had been updated with documents showing power of attorney and a medical letter confirming cognitive decline. "Ma'am, you'll need to come in person to resolve this." I felt the heat rise from my stomach to my ears. I could barely choke out a thank you before hanging up. I stared at my own hands. They looked like my mother's hands now, older, softer, but they were steady. I wasn't losing my mind. I knew what he'd done. I knew how. I just didn't know how far he was willing to go. Carol drove me to the bank that afternoon. I tried to dress like my old self, neat blouse, earrings, fresh lipstick. The banker who met with me looked at me the way people look at stray cats, polite but wary. I told him I wanted to reverse the changes. He said I needed to present new medical evaluations and potentially go to court. I said, "Why would I need to prove I'm not senile when I never agreed I was?" He just blinked. I asked to see the documents Ethan had used. After some resistance, he handed me a photocopy of a printed letter from a Dr. Robert Lyman stating that Louise Bennett, me, was showing significant memory gaps, financial confusion, and executive dysfunction consistent with early-stage dementia. It was dated 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, I was doing my taxes by hand and winning the crossword tournament at the senior center. I'd never even heard of this doctor. There was a phone number on the letterhead, so I called it right there in the bank office. Disconnected. Of course it was. That was the moment I realized Ethan hadn't just stolen from me. He was trying to erase me. He wanted people to think I was no longer reliable, no longer safe, no longer sane. That way, he could justify taking everything. If anyone questioned him, he could say, "She's not well," and the world would nod and smile and look away. That night, back at Carol's, I was halfway through a lukewarm bowl of soup when I remembered Sarah, Ethan's ex-wife. They hadn't spoken in years, not since the divorce. But I had her number saved, hidden under a different name in my phone. Because Ethan once told me not to get involved in his past. I called her. She answered after 4 rings, confused. I introduced myself. There was a pause. Then she said, "Louise, are you okay?" That question caught me off guard. It was the first time in days someone had asked it like they actually cared. I said, "No, I'm not. I think Ethan's trying to destroy me." There was another pause. She sighed, and then she said something that still echoes in my head. "You're not the first." The next day, she picked me up in her scuffed-up sedan. She looked tired, but composed. She bought me coffee and listened as I explained what happened. Then she said something quiet, but heavy. He tried to pull the same thing with me when we split. Told people I was unstable. Tried to get me fired from my nursing job. I looked at her stunned. I'd always thought Sarah was the dramatic one. Ethan painted her that way. But here she was, helping me when no one else would. She handed me a file folder. These are from our divorce. Screenshots, messages, even some old recordings. I didn't know who to give them to. Maybe now they'll matter. She didn't say it, but I could tell. She still carried that damage, tucked under her ribs like a scar. We didn't hug. We're not huggers. But we sat in her car a little longer than we needed to, both of us staring straight ahead. That night, I slept better than I had in days, not because things were fixed, but because I wasn't alone anymore. And when I woke up, I had a plan. If Ethan wanted to treat me like I was incompetent, I'd show him exactly how dangerous an old woman with nothing left to lose could be. The day after meeting with Sarah, I went back to the bank, not because I expected them to suddenly believe me, but because I needed copies, paper, proof, something I could show someone smarter than me who might know what the hell to do next. The woman behind the counter was younger this time, early 20s maybe, and clearly uncomfortable. She said she couldn't release anything without the guardian's consent, and I almost laughed. I leaned forward and said, "Sweetheart, I'm the one who gave birth to the so-called guardian, and he can't even spell fiduciary." She looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor, but eventually handed me the customer assistance number. That led me to a voicemail tree so deep it felt like a test of my sanity. 2 hours and 1 sandwich break later, I ended up with a phone appointment with a supervisor. His name was Todd. Of course it was Todd. He was polite, efficient, and clearly terrified of saying the wrong thing. I told him what happened, how I never authorized anyone to be my power of attorney, how I never met the doctor who supposedly wrote that letter, how I'd never even been in the hospital, let alone diagnosed with dementia. Todd said he'd escalate it. I asked what that meant. He said it meant someone else would look at it. I wanted to scream. Instead, I thanked him. Again. That's what you do when you're older. You thank people even when they're screwing you over, because being polite is the last weapon they haven't taken from you. Back at Carol's, I sat down with Sarah and Curtis, this legal aid attorney she recommended. He was young, sharp, and just angry enough on my behalf that I didn't hate his confidence. He asked to see everything: bank papers, the forged medical letter, the folder Sarah gave me. He flipped through it all quickly, like he'd done this kind of thing before. Then he said something I wasn't ready for. "We're going to need to pull your credit report." I asked why, and he said, "Because if your son got power of attorney and access to your identity, there's a good chance he didn't stop at your bank account." My stomach dropped, and he was right. When the report came in 2 days later, it was like reading the biography of someone pretending to be me. There were 2 credit cards I'd never applied for. One with nearly $30,000 in charges, mostly cash, advances and online poker. Another had maxed out on what looked like home electronics and flight tickets. There was even a car loan application pending under my name for a 2019 BMW. A BMW. I haven't driven anything newer than a 2005 Toyota. Curtis looked through it, his jaw tight, and muttered, "This is full-scale identity theft. Not just access, he's rebuilding a life in your name." I felt like the walls were moving, like nothing was solid anymore. I kept thinking, what if I'd never checked? What if I'd just kept sitting on Carol's couch drinking her sleepy time tea, assuming this was just a family misunderstanding? I would have woken up one day with debt collectors at my door and no home to go back to. Curtis started drafting a cease and desist letter, but he said we needed more. Bank statements, phone records, any kind of communication between Ethan and these institutions. That's when I remembered the little fireproof safe I kept under the floorboard before Ethan took it. I told them about it, and Sarah said, "He probably took the documents and scanned them. If we can prove they were used in applications without your consent, we might have something." That gave Curtis an idea. He pulled up a search for reverse mortgages and started looking for property transactions under my name. And sure enough, there it was. My home had been tied into a pending reverse mortgage loan, the kind that's pitched to seniors on daytime TV like it's some magic solution. He'd used fake documents and a forged version of my signature to start the process. The paperwork was paused only because the loan company was waiting for one last piece of verification. My in-person approval, which he was likely planning to fake or coerce somehow. I sat there staring at the screen, realizing just how far he'd planned this. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a bad decision made. In desperation. This was weeks, maybe months of premeditation, step by step like a puzzle. Erase the parent. Take the assets. Use her identity until it runs dry. I didn't cry. I think I'd run out of tears by then. I just sat there, quietly boiling in a kind of rage I didn't know I was capable of. Curtis looked at me and said, "We can fight this. It's going to be messy, but we can fight it." And I believed him, but I also knew one thing with absolute certainty. If Ethan was willing to rewrite my life on paper, he'd do worse in person. So from that moment forward, I stopped hoping he'd come to his senses. I stopped wondering what went wrong in his childhood. I stopped thinking of him as my son. I started thinking of him as a thief with my name on his bank card. After Curtis showed me how deep the identity theft went, I couldn't stop thinking about all the ways Ethan must have prepared for this. It was like realizing you'd been living next to a volcano and only just noticed the smoke. Every time I opened a drawer or thought about some old form or file I used to keep, I had to wonder if he'd gotten to it. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I sat at Carol's kitchen table, flipping through Sarah's folder again. Most of it was from the divorce. Emails, bank transfers, screenshots of texts where Ethan called her crazy, tried to gaslight her about their finances, accused her of cheating. The tone was familiar. That same cold arrogance he used with me, except worse, like he didn't even see her as a person. There was one audio file I hadn't noticed before, saved on a small pink USB drive, clipped to a paperclip. It was a voicemail. Ethan's voice, slurred but clear. "I don't care what the court says. You owe me. I made this whole life for you, and I can take it back just as easy." I didn't realize I'd clenched my teeth until my jaw started to hurt. The next morning, I asked Sarah if we could talk somewhere quiet. She picked me up again in her old car, and we drove to the park. Not many people were out, just a few joggers and some older folks walking their dogs. We sat in the car with the windows cracked. I told her what Curtis found, and she didn't look surprised. Instead, she reached into the glove compartment and pulled out another envelope. "I wasn't sure if I should bring this," she said. "It's from after the divorce, when he started spiraling. I thought maybe he'd cool down, but then he sent me this." Inside was a printed email chain between Ethan and someone named Nate Trillman. At first glance, it looked like boring business stuff, mentions of wire transfers, project timelines, but Curtis had taught me what to look for. One of the emails had an attachment listed as L. Bennett Pension Breakdown.xls. I felt like throwing up. Sarah leaned back in her seat and said, "I didn't know what it meant at the time. I thought maybe it was some inheritance thing, but I think he was already working with this guy to move your money." I asked how she got it, and she said she'd hacked into one of his old Gmail accounts after the divorce, back when he left himself signed in on her laptop. She'd saved it all just in case. I asked her why she hadn't told me any of this sooner. She hesitated, then said, "Because I didn't think you'd believe me. You always treated me like I was being too harsh with him, like he was just stressed." She wasn't wrong. Back when they were married, I always tried to stay neutral. I told myself it wasn't my place. I didn't want to choose sides. Turns out, not choosing is still choosing. And I'd chosen to believe the version of Ethan he wanted me to see. We drove to Curtis's office with the envelope. He was already on a call but waved us in. When he saw what we had, he sat up straighter. "This changes things," he said. The email trail showed Ethan had been planning financial transfers for months, and he wasn't working alone. Nate Trillman, according to a quick background check, had been tied to multiple shell companies and offshore accounts in the past. Nothing major, but enough to make you raise an eyebrow. Curtis said we'd need to build a case proving Ethan had used those connections to hide stolen funds. "We're talking about wire fraud now," he said. "This isn't just identity theft. This is organized." I looked at Sarah. She was staring at the floor, arms folded tight. I reached out and touched her elbow. "You did the right thing," I said, and I meant it. She gave me a tired smile. On the way home, we stopped by her apartment so she could grab some old hard drives. I watched her buzz herself in with this practiced, tired motion, like she'd been carrying the weight of all this for years. And she had. Back at Carol's, I sat on the guest bed and looked through one of my old planners. In the margins of the pages, I'd written reminders to call Ethan, check in on him, ask if he needed anything. I used to worry so much about whether he felt supported. I never stopped to ask myself if he was using that support like a rope, to pull himself up or to strangle me slowly. I closed the planner and packed it away in a drawer. I didn't need reminders anymore. I needed receipts, timestamps, names. We weren't just telling the truth now, we were building a case. And thanks to Sarah, we had our first real crack in his perfect little lie. Curtis moved fast after seeing the emails Sarah gave us. He submitted an emergency request for a protective injunction and started drafting the civil suit paperwork. But what caught me off guard was how quickly the other side responded. Less than a week later, I got served at Carol's house by a courier with a stack of legal papers that felt heavier than they looked. Ethan had filed a petition in probate court claiming I was unfit to manage my own finances and required a conservator, him. He was trying to make the fraud official. Curtis said we had to go to court and fast. The hearing would decide whether a judge believed I had full control over my faculties or whether Ethan could continue managing my assets. That weekend, I sat in Sarah's apartment going through every bit of mail I could remember forwarding. To Ethan over the last year, insurance documents, tax stuff, pension letters. At the time, I thought I was just being helpful, making things easier for him to help me. But now I saw it for what it was. I had handed him the keys to everything, and he used them to lock me out. The court date came faster than I expected. I wore my nicest blazer, one that still had shoulder pads, and the only pair of shoes that didn't make my feet ache. Curtis met us on the courthouse steps, calm and confident, like he'd done this 100 times. I tried to channel that energy, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Inside, we sat across from Ethan and his lawyer. Ethan didn't even look at me. He was clean-shaven, wearing a navy suit that I had definitely never seen him afford before, and he looked relaxed, like he'd already won. When the judge walked in, everyone stood, and I kept my chin up, but the weight of it all pressed on my spine. Ethan's lawyer went first. He called me a sweet woman with a deteriorating mind, said I was vulnerable to confusion, unable to keep track of finances, and prone to paranoia. I wanted to laugh, because if I was so confused, how did I remember every single thing he said, down to the fake emails and the forged documents? Then they brought in their expert, a doctor, real this time, not the ghost from that letter, but he had never examined me. He spoke in general terms about symptoms of aging, about cognitive decline. He used phrases like plausible misjudgments and pattern of risk, which sounded a lot fancier than your son is robbing you blind. When it was my turn, Curtis asked if I'd be comfortable speaking. I nodded, even though my throat felt dry and my stomach was tight. He led me through questions, my name, my birthday, where I lived, what day it was, who the president was, all the easy ones. Then he asked me to explain what happened. I looked at the judge and said everything as clearly as I could, about the forged documents, the reversed bank transactions, the voicemail Ethan left for Sarah, the car he drove off in that belonged to me. I told her I wasn't a perfect mother, but I knew the difference between confusion and betrayal. The judge listened, but I couldn't read her face. Then Ethan's lawyer started cross-examining me. He asked if I'd ever forgotten my keys, if I'd ever gotten lost while driving, if I had trouble remembering appointments. I said yes to all of it, because who hasn't? Then he tried to twist it, implying that my reliance on Sarah and Curtis showed I couldn't function alone. I said, I have friends, not handlers. He didn't like that, but I could feel the room shifting. When Curtis brought up the credit reports and showed the court documents with Ethan's fake LLC, things got quiet, really quiet. The judge asked about the flash drive. Sarah had brought it in, and the clerk confirmed its chain of custody. Inside were scans of my pension statements labeled for export, with login attempts from Ethan's old IP address. The courtroom had no reaction, but I saw it in Ethan's face, the first crack. He blinked more, shifted in his seat, adjusted his tie like it was suddenly too tight. The judge didn't make a ruling that day. She said she'd review all the materials and issue A written decision. That drive back to Carol's felt longer than usual. I didn't cry, but I didn't talk much either. My head was buzzing with everything I'd said, everything I hadn't. What if I'd stumbled more? What if I'd sounded unsure? What if they believed him? Curtis told me we'd done well. Sarah said I looked like someone who knew exactly who she was, but I couldn't feel any of that. I just felt tired, not the kind you sleep off, the kind that lives in your bones. I went to bed early that night, but I kept seeing the judge's face every time I closed my eyes. Not angry, not warm, just unreadable. And that scared me more than anything else, because it meant we were still in limbo, still in his game, and I had no idea how much time I had before he made his next move. 3 days after the court hearing, I was still waiting on the judge's decision, and every hour felt like it stretched, twice as long as it should. I kept checking my phone even though I knew there wouldn't be a message, pacing around Carol's living room like I was wearing a groove into her floor. Curtis had said it might take a week, maybe more, and that no news didn't mean bad news. But that kind of logic doesn't help much when your entire life is sitting on a judge's desk. I tried to stay distracted. Sarah came by with groceries and some old crime show DVDs she thought I'd like. I made us grilled cheese and tomato soup, and we watched half an episode before I realized I hadn't heard a word of it. Sarah noticed, too. She muted the TV and said, "You look like you're waiting for a thunderstorm." I said, "Feels more like a tornado." She didn't argue. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I went to the kitchen and made tea. I stood by the window, watching the dark stretch across the neighborhood, when I saw headlights slow down in front of Carol's house. They paused there, just long enough to make the hairs on my arms stand up, then rolled on. I didn't recognize the car, but my gut clenched anyway. I turned off the kitchen light and went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I just laid there, eyes wide, listening. Around 2 a.m, there was a sharp crack. I shot up in bed, heart pounding. "Carol," yelled from her room. I ran to the living room and found the front window shattered, glass scattered across the rug like salt. A rock was lying in the middle of the room. Sarah had stayed the night, thank God, and she was already on the phone with the police. When they arrived, they took notes, looked around, and said they'd file a report, but there wasn't much they could do. No cameras, no fingerprints, no witnesses. One of the officers asked if I had any enemies. I said, "Only my son." He gave me a look like he didn't know whether to take that seriously. After they left, Sarah and I cleaned up the glass as best we could. Neither of us said much. The silence said enough. The next morning, Carol installed a camera above the porch. Her nephew came by with tools and didn't ask questions. I appreciated that. Curtis checked in and said he'd start pushing for a restraining order, but warned me that without a confirmed threat or proof Ethan was behind it, the court might not go for it. Sarah and I stayed on alert. We took turns being home. She installed extra locks on her door. We kept the lights on even during the day. That kind of fear settles into your bones. It makes you jump at the sound of a door closing or a car backfiring down the street. A couple days later, Sarah's car was keyed. Deep scratches all along the driver's side. No note, no witnesses, no cameras. We didn't even bother calling the police that time. We just looked at each other and knew. Later that week, Curtis called me into his office. He looked serious, but not panicked, which I took as a good sign. He handed me a manila envelope and said, "Someone's been messing with my mail." Inside were 2 letters, court communications, both meant for me, both dated nearly 2 weeks ago. One was about a follow-up hearing. The other was about the status of Ethan's conservatorship. Request. Both had been sent to Curtis's office, but never made it to him directly. He only found them because his receptionist noticed a tear in the corner of one envelope and got suspicious. I asked how that could happen. He said, "We checked the building's security footage. Ethan showed up here after hours last week. He was in the lobby for 7 minutes. I sat there, staring at the letters, realizing how much closer he'd gotten without me even knowing. Curtis said they were checking if anything else had gone missing. I asked how he even got in. He said he used a guest code, one we stopped using months ago but never disabled. I didn't say anything for a while, just sat there holding the letters like they might dissolve if I squeezed hard enough. Curtis said, "This isn't just manipulation anymore. It's sabotage. And I believed him. That night, I packed a bag and moved in with Sarah. I couldn't stay at Carol's. I couldn't risk putting her in danger. Sarah set up a cot in her spare room, and we installed 2 more cameras, one on the back door, one by the street. I slept with the hallway light on. I kept my phone under my pillow. Every sound made me flinch, but I also felt something I hadn't in weeks: momentum. Fear, yes, but also focus. Ethan wanted me to feel hunted. He wanted me isolated, paranoid, doubting myself. But all he'd done was light a fire, and he had no idea how hot it could burn. Curtis said the next step was to figure out who Ethan was working with, and that meant we had to take a closer look at the name Sarah had found in those emails: Nate Trillman. It wasn't a name either of us recognized, but Curtis had access to a few investigative tools and ran a background check. Nate had a string of business registrations tied to his name, most of them now inactive. A couple were flagged in financial watch lists for suspicious offshore activity. Nothing that screamed criminal, but enough to raise eyebrows if someone cared to look. Curtis said, "If Ethan funneled anything through this guy, we need to know what and how." Meanwhile, Sarah and I stayed cautious. We kept every receipt, every login record, and Curtis set up a secure folder for our evidence. It felt a little ridiculous at times, like we were preparing for a war in a courtroom. But then I'd look at the broken window, or the keyed car, or the mail Ethan had tampered with, and I'd remember this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control, and I'd let him have too much of it for too long. Curtis managed to trace one of Ethan's recent transactions to a dormant checking account in Nate's name. The trail stopped there. It had been closed a week after the money came in, but it was enough to confirm a connection. I asked Curtis if it was illegal. He said, "It will be when we show the intent behind it." Then, like fate had a schedule to keep, Sarah called me from her apartment one afternoon while I was out with Carol. She sounded breathless. "You need to come over. I found something." When I got there, she was sitting cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom, holding an old shoebox. I was cleaning out the closet and found this behind a false panel. Inside was a black USB flash drive, small and scratched up, with no label. She said it had been Ethan's from years ago, something he probably forgot he even left behind. We plugged it into her laptop, half expecting nothing, or maybe junk files. What we found made my throat tighten. There were dozens of files. Some were PDFs of bank statements, mine, labeled under LB Archive. Others were images of signed forms, and not just scanned, digitally manipulated. I watched in silence as Sarah opened one that showed my signature pasted onto a different pension authorization form. The metadata showed it had been edited on a Tuesday morning, 3 months before he locked me out. Sarah kept digging. In one folder marked Ref, there was a short video clip. It looked like a screen recording from a phone. Ethan, sitting at what looked like a kitchen table, laughing. He said something like, "She has no idea. I could be buying guns with her money, and she'd still be talking about Sunday brunch." I didn't laugh. Sarah didn't either. The video was barely 30 seconds, but it told us everything. He knew what he was doing. He was proud of it. Curtis came over that night. We showed him everything. He didn't say much while watching the video, just nodded and took notes. "This is the smoking gun," he said quietly. Literally. He asked if he could duplicate the drive and log the chain of custody. We handed it over. The next morning, he filed it as part of the growing civil case and also alerted the district attorney's office. That changed things. The DA's office started asking questions. A small inquiry at first, then more serious once they saw the forged documents and video evidence. Curtis said if we were lucky, this wouldn't just stay in civil court. Ethan could face criminal charges, fraud, identity theft, even elder abuse. It was strange, the way hope showed up. Not loud, not flashy, just a quiet feeling in the gut that maybe, finally, people were starting to see the truth. That weekend, I cleaned out my old purse and found a folded receipt from a gas station dated the same day I'd been locked out. I remembered buying him snacks, thinking he was just stressed and needed comfort. It made me angry all over again. How I'd tried to mother someone who saw me as a mark, but this time the anger felt clean, useful, like fuel. Sarah and I sat up late that night, organizing evidence, labeling folders, drinking tea with too much sugar. She said, "You think he knows we're coming for him?" I said, "He will." Because for the first time, I wasn't reacting, I was preparing. And Ethan had no idea how much of a problem I was about to become. After the DA got involved, Curtis warned us to stay low-key, said that once word got back to Ethan about the investigation, he'd either go into panic mode or push harder, and knowing Ethan, neither option would be quiet. I didn't have to wait long. The first sign came from the library, of all places. I'd worked there for over 30 years, and though I'd retired a while back, I still stopped by every few weeks to catch up with a few old friends. That day, I walked in like usual, expecting nothing. But the looks I got were different. More cautious, a little awkward. One of the girls at the front desk, Dana, who used to help me carry boxes to my car, pulled me aside and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, and she hesitated before saying, "It's just, we saw something online." My stomach turned. She showed me a Facebook post, shared by a page I'd never heard of but clearly followed by a lot of people in town. It was a video, edited to make it look like I was rambling incoherently, walking in circles in my backyard, yelling at squirrels. Except it wasn't my backyard, and it wasn't me. It was some grainy clip of an older woman who vaguely looked like me from behind, paired with an audio track of a completely different voice. The caption read, "Sad to see what dementia does to our elders. Prayers for Louise Bennett." There were hundreds of shares. I felt my face go hot. Dana looked mortified. I thanked her for showing me, then walked straight out the front door. By the time I got back to Sarah's, it had already spread to local groups and message boards. Curtis called me that evening, said someone tried to anonymously submit that video as evidence to the court. Luckily, he caught it before it was added to any filings. But he was furious. "He's not just playing dirty," he said. "He's trying to assassinate your character in public so the court doubts you." In private, I asked what we could do about it. He said, "We keep building the case. We stay focused. We don't stoop to his level." Which sounded noble, but I'll be honest, I wanted to stoop. I wanted to kick dirt and throw things and scream. But instead, I printed the video post and added it to the folder. A few days later, Curtis pushed forward a request for a restraining order again, this time with the new mail tampering footage and the drive's video file as context. We weren't just showing harassment anymore. We were showing escalation. The court finally approved it. Ethan was legally banned from contacting me directly, coming near Sarah's apartment, or appearing at Curtis's office. The win felt small, but it was something. And that night, I finally slept a full 6 hours without waking up in a panic. Then, as if he could sense we'd scored a point, Ethan retaliated. Curtis received an alert from a banking contact. Someone tried to log into an account tied to my pension again, this time using credentials from a third-party service. The login failed, but it triggered a fraud alert. The attempt had come from a server outside the US, masked through a VPN. Curtis said it was likely Ethan, trying to move whatever was left before we froze it. We filed the report, but it made one thing clear: he wasn't going to give up. Around that time, I got an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a printed form, an LLC registration, listing my name as the founder of a business I'd never heard of, Bennett Senior Services, LLC. It claimed I'd employed Ethan as my paid in-home caregiver for the past 2 years and listed Sarah's apartment as the business address. The guts on him. He tried to fabricate a fake business to launder stolen pension payments, all under the guise of elder care. Curtis lost it when he saw it. He filed it with the DA, along with a formal complaint for attempted financial fraud through a false business entity. It was like watching the threads unravel in real time. Everything Ethan had tried to cover was starting to surface, and there was no neat way for him to backpedal anymore. Sarah and I sat at her kitchen table one night, surrounded by paper stacks, flash drives, court letters, and post-it notes. I looked at the mess and said, "This isn't how I thought my retirement would look." She smirked and passed me a sticky note shaped like a cat. "You're kind of badass," she said. I didn't say it out loud, but I finally believed her. The fight wasn't over, not yet, but for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like we were winning, not just surviving, but actually turning the tide. And Ethan, for all his slick manipulation and dirty tactics, was starting to run out of places to hide. The official court date landed on a Wednesday, which felt weirdly appropriate, right in the middle of the week, not a clean beginning or end, just a place where things shift. Curtis was ready, and so were we. He'd compiled everything: the forged documents, the flash drive, the bank reports, Sarah's screenshots, the video of Ethan bragging, even the LLC paperwork. It was stacked in a box with labels, tabs, color-coded sections. I looked at it and thought, if paperwork could scream, this box would be shouting. Sarah and I got to the courthouse early. She wore a dark blazer I hadn't seen before and kept tapping her fingers on the armrest of the waiting bench. I asked if she was nervous, and she said, "I just want it over with." Same. Curtis joined us 10 minutes before the hearing, calm as ever, and said everything was going to be all right. I nodded, but I wasn't ready to believe that until I heard the gavel hit wood. When they called us in, Ethan was already sitting with his lawyer. Same smug face, same polished act. He looked thinner, though, and kept checking his phone like someone who knew time was running out. The judge entered, and we all stood, then sat. First, the judge asked if there were any updates to the case. Curtis stood and handed over the most recent packet, the fake business registration, complete with cross-referenced address data, showing that Ethan had filed government forms pretending to be my caretaker while stealing funds from a pension. He'd rerouted. That got the judge's attention. Then came the witnesses. First, Sarah. She walked to the stand like she'd done it before, steady and serious. She testified about the marriage, about the threats, about the evidence she found, and handed over. Then Curtis asked her about the email folder with Nate Trillman's name, and she explained it in detail, how she found it, why she kept it, what she believed Ethan and Nate were doing. Ethan's lawyer tried to shake her, brought up her past. Relationship with Ethan, suggested she had a grudge. Sarah didn't flinch. If I had a grudge, she said, he'd know it. I kept quiet because I was scared. I'm not scared anymore. The room got real quiet after that. Then Curtis called the bank manager from my credit union. He confirmed under oath that account changes were made without in-person verification, that login attempts were flagged, and that the login credentials used match devices connected to Ethan's known IP addresses. After that came the digital forensics guy Curtis had hired, a soft-spoken man in glasses who showed how Ethan's laptop, confirmed via purchase records, had edited the PDF files, tied to my pension withdrawals. When he played the clip from the flash drive, Ethan on camera, laughing about taking my money, the silence in the courtroom wasn't shocked so much as final, like everyone had seen enough. Ethan's lawyer looked like he'd swallowed a handful of tacks. When Curtis rested our case, the judge turned to Ethan's side and asked if they'd like to proceed. Ethan's lawyer stood, whispered something to him, and then, in a moment I'll never forget, Ethan stood up without being asked and said, "She ruined my future. You think I wanted to be some broke failure? I deserved that money. She owed me. Everything she had, she got because of me." The judge raised her hand and told him to sit. He didn't. He went on, ranting about sacrifices, about how I hadn't helped him enough, about how he was entitled to at least some of it. The court officers stepped forward, and only then did he stop. The judge looked at me, then back at him, then down at the files. She said she was ready to rule. It was short, clear, and final. Ethan's conservatorship petition was denied. All power of attorney documents were voided. My accounts would be returned to my full control. Ethan would be reported to the state Attorney General for criminal referral under charges of financial fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. And he would be remanded into custody for violating the restraining order with the mail incident. The gavel came down, and for the first time in months, I let my shoulders drop. Sarah touched my arm. Curtis gave a nod. Ethan was escorted out in cuffs, still trying to talk, but no one was listening. We walked out of that courtroom into the light like survivors stepping out of a storm shelter. And even though my heart was still pounding and my knees felt like jelly, I walked taller than I had in a long time because we didn't just win. We exposed the whole truth, and there was no taking it back. After the ruling, everything moved fast. Faster than I expected. Ethan was taken into custody right there in the courtroom. And just like that, the person who'd turned my life upside down was no longer just a threat. I watched him leave in handcuffs, no special treatment, no last-minute speech, just escorted through a side door like every other defendant who thought they were smarter than the law. Curtis handled most of the post-trial paperwork. He was calm, thorough, the same way he'd been since day one, but I could see it in his eyes. Relief. He told me restitution was being processed and that I'd get back what hadn't been moved. Offshore, plus a formal apology from the court for the delay in freezing Ethan's access. I didn't care much about the apology, but getting my pension back meant I could stop counting cans in the pantry and pretending I wasn't worried about running out of shampoo. Back at Sarah's, we toasted with cheap, sparkling cider in plastic cups. Carol came by with a casserole and a stack of paper plates. It wasn't some big party, just a quiet night with people who'd shown up when it counted. Curtis stayed for a bit, then left with a thank you card I'd written the night before and pretended I hadn't. Sarah and I sat on her couch and watched an old episode of Jeopardy, and for once, I didn't feel like I needed to be checking my phone or double-locking the door. A week later, I moved back into my house. I stood in the front yard for a long time before unlocking the door. It looked smaller somehow, not because it had changed, but because I had. I walked through the rooms, letting my fingers brush the walls. I didn't cry. I just breathed. The air smelled a little dusty, like it had been waiting for me. I spent the next few days cleaning, fixing things Ethan had ignored, going through drawers and tossing whatever didn't matter anymore. I kept some things, though. A few old pictures, a scarf he'd bought me years ago before everything fell apart. I didn't do it out of sentiment. I just didn't feel like letting him take anything else from me, even the good memories. Curtis asked if I'd be willing to speak at a local event he was organizing for elder fraud awareness. At first, I said no. I didn't want to become the face of anything. Didn't want to be the woman who got robbed by her son. But then I thought about all the calls I'd made where no one believed me. All the times someone used the word confused, like it meant disposable, and I changed my mind. I stood in front of a room full of strangers, hands trembling slightly, and told the truth. Not the sanitized version, not the polite one. I told them what it felt like to be erased, to fight back, to win. People listened. A few came up afterward, asked for resources, said they had questions about their own families. That mattered more than I expected. A month later, I joined the advisory board for the legal aid clinic Curtis worked with. I wasn't doing anything fancy, just helping with admin, making coffee, answering phones. But it felt good to be part of something, to have purpose again that wasn't about surviving. Sarah came with me to a follow-up hearing when Ethan tried to appeal his sentence. It didn't go anywhere. The judge reviewed the evidence and shut it down before he could say more than a sentence. He was sentenced to 5 years, with a mandatory restitution agreement. I didn't attend the formal sentencing. I didn't need to hear it to know it was over. What I did do, though, was mail him a photo. It was just me and Sarah, standing outside the courthouse, holding hands and smiling. No note, no threat, just a message, a reminder. I didn't send it out of spite. I sent it because he needed to understand that he didn't end me, that his plan didn't work, and I wanted him to see exactly what survival looked like. Last week, I stood in front of a packed room at the local community center, holding a microphone I didn't ask for, and read a speech I wrote on the back of an old electric bill. I told the audience, sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who know your favorite childhood story. That doesn't mean they get to keep the pen. People clapped. A few cried. When I walked off that stage, I felt something settle in me, like all the shattered pieces had finally found their place. I still have days where I flinch when the doorbell rings or double-check the locks before bed, but I don't live in fear anymore. I live in my home on my terms, and after everything Ethan tried to take, I still have the one thing he couldn't forge, fake, or steal, my voice. And now I use it every damn day.